Hello and welcome to The Writer's Mindset with me, Christina Adams.
And me, Ellie Betts.
Each week, we're here to help you persevere through the tough times, be your most productive self, and get that work in progress published.
Wherever you are in your publishing journey, we've got your back.
Today, we're speaking to Becca Syme about author burnout.
Big shout out to our podcast patrons for all of your support.
As a patron, you'll get early access to episodes, the chance to submit questions for our guests, and access to our bonus series, Healthy Habits.
Healthy Habits isn't your typical productivity advice. We're not here to tell you to get up at 4 a.m. and go for a 3-hour run.
Hell no. We're exploring the latest research to find small changes you can make in your life to be happier, healthier, and more productive in your writing life and beyond.
To start developing healthier habits today, come join our community at patreon.com/writers mindset.
Today, our guest is the lovely Becca Syme, talking about a very important topic, which is author burnout. Welcome to the Writer's Mindset.
Thank you so much for having me. I will say I love talking about burnout. I hate that we have to talk about it.
Oh yeah.
But I do love talking about it. Yeah, it's sort of painful, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So before we get ahead of ourselves, can you just explain to our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do, please?
Yeah, I am primarily what's called a success coach. And as a fiction author, started coaching some of my friends and then started coaching authors. And now I think we're 16 or 17 years in, and about 7 years into coaching authors, have coached 5,700 plus individual authors at this point, and then have done, I would say a full third of my coaching at this point is burnout, essentially.
Wow. Although actually, I'm not that surprised because nearly every author I haven't spoken to before that I end up talking to has either burnt out at some point or come extremely close to it.
Yeah. Yep. I agree.
It's such a horrible pattern.
Yeah, it really is. And some of it is the industry itself sort of produces that. Some of it is, systemic and environmental and all these other things, right? Like what's going on in the world. Some of it is that. But yeah, some of it is really just the industry is not friendly toward people who set boundaries for themselves, which is unfortunate, but yeah.
It's not cool, but we can change that slowly but surely, hopefully.
I hope so.
I hope so too. Regarding yourself then, you have the books, you have QuitBooks and Quitcast. How did the idea for those come about? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, and actually it plays into burnout a little bit because when I first started, I had gone through major burnout in my professional career as a coach, and I was a nonprofit executive at the time. And I saw, like, when you go through burnout, you realize that not everything you think you're supposed to do is worth doing or has to be done. And so the whole kind of philosophy behind my coaching career has always been, if there's something that you can quit doing, like if there's something that you're able to quit and it's not going to make a big enough impact on your life or business that you should worry about it, then you should quit it. And so when I started writing the very first book, which is Dear Writer, You Need to Quit, I think a lot of people thought I was trying to encourage writers to quit writing, but actually my goal was to try to encourage them to quit almost everything else that they were doing because they were, quote, told they should, and because it would, quote, make a difference. And I do use quotes intentionally. Most of the things that we do don't make a difference, but we don't ever evaluate whether they do or not. And so my whole goal was kind of the questioning of the premise of, yeah, you should do that, and you should do that, and you should do that. And I'm like, yeah, but should you? And that's kind of how that whole philosophy came about.
Do you ever find that when you tell authors that they should give up X, Y, or Z, that they push back and go, oh, no, I definitely need to do this thing that maybe isn't moving the needle as much as they think it is?
Oh, yeah. Like people say that all the time. And then I always ask, what makes you think that, right? Like, what is the either who's telling you that, or what in the industry is making you think that you need to do that. And I think the unfortunate part is that most of what we think we need to do, the only reason we think we need to do it is because other people have said we should be doing it. And we're not actually looking at our own results in terms of like, so the catchphrase that I always say about your evaluation is if you can't tell whether or not it's making a difference, it's not making a difference. And so a lot of us are just so unaware of what's actually moving the needle for us that we're not really evaluating whether or not things work.
Yeah, we're kind of taught a bit of a spray and pray approach sometimes, I think.
Yes.
And I don't know if that's like come from the corporate world or out of desperation to make it big or a bit of both. But I've definitely noticed authors want to do all the things. And I get that. I like doing lots of things. That's more because I get bored than anything else.
Yeah.
But I really like when we spoke to Nicholas Eric, he said like in his book that you should basically focus on three things and make sure they're things you enjoy doing and that actually make a difference. Don't like and channel all your energy into those things because you'll get more done and see greater returns.
Right. Yeah, I think that's that will definitely work for some people in terms of like limiting it that much will definitely work for some people. For some people, and you mentioned that like I get bored quickly and so I need to do all these other things. For some people, my best advice is just don't keep doing everything that you start. Like quit things very quickly, because so the spread of people who need to do that, like only do one thing and do it really great, like that whole I think there was actually a book that came out that was called One Thing, right? And it was very high focus, like only pay attention to one thing. The people who do well with that need to do that. And then the people who don't, but they still need to know to quit stuff quickly. So like if you are a person who gets bored and tries everything, then you can't also be the person who continues to do everything that you start. So I feel like whichever of those two sides you fall into, one of them needs to be the approach that you take. We can't just indiscriminately keep doing everything that we think is going to move the needle.
And one thing you said there in particular is evaluating whether it's working, like stepping back and evaluating. And I don't think I've really done that very much, to be honest with you. I don't think I've really thought about it enough to do that, to have that awareness of each different technique. So that's interesting as well.
Yeah, the evaluation process for me has to include both my own feelings on the subject, because I think a lot of us have an intuitive sense for what really works for us and what doesn't, that we don't pay attention to enough, and also some kind of objective measure, right? Like, is it actually making me money? And I know a lot of people who are in the nonfiction industry have some really good tools about how to evaluate that stuff. And I think there's some that are readily available, like, picking which of the places that I'm spending my time are really making an impact on sales, for instance, but I think we don't often enough ask questions about our well-being. Like, is it actually, because like, and I'm not anti-TikTok. I personally love TikTok, but TikTok is a great example that's current to, our 2022 life. It is currently becoming the fad for everyone to try to utilize TikTok as heavily as they can, but we're not taking into account how it affects our well-being. So some of us who are not seeing the kind of results that other people are seeing, but we're spending 50, 60, 75% of our time trying to make TikTok work, that it's, quote, supposed to work for everyone, then we are not actually evaluating the cost to our own self. And then additionally, we're often not evaluating the results that we're getting on it with an objective eye.
Definitely. I mean, as a side note, on a smaller scale, I have a TikTok for my cat, and the amount of time it takes just to get a little bit of attention on there. And I was just doing it for fun. Like, I don't really do it to get the views necessarily. It was mostly for fun because I like sharing cute videos of my cat, and my friends are sick of them. But yeah, it does take a lot of work. And there were points where like one video would get a little bit of attention, and then I'm trying to manage all that time to reply to people and keep up the content release and stuff like that. So I can imagine if you do that on a bigger scale, like where you're actually trying to make money on TikTok, it must be so draining.
Yeah, and for some people it doesn't drain them on that level. So they're the ones who are like, listen, this is so amazing and awesome. Or people who are seeing really, really high level results, right? Where they might actually be able to hire someone to manage their TikTok accounts for them. And the difference between people, and this is kind of where my specialty is, right? Is like, I don't believe that there's any one rule that works for everyone. So I don't think there's this magic like balance of numbers of whatever that you need to do that every single person needs to take into account, because I just haven't seen that to be the case in all of the coaching that I've done. Everyone's differences matter. So we have to also then, though, acknowledge that sometimes those differences make a bigger impact on someone else's outcome than we would like to acknowledge. So like if someone happens to be both good at TikTok and it feeds them, and then I am not as good at TikTok and it drains me, we often don't take that into account when we're making the decision about whether we should do it or not. We just hear the rule, right? We're like, oh, well, clearly I should do this thing. And therefore that means that at whatever cost to my own health and well-being, at whatever cost to my platform, I just need to do this thing. And then Becca comes along and is like, no, you don't. There is no
Quit
rule.
it, quit it.
Question the premise, like quit. And again, like I said, I love TikTok. I use it constantly. But I do see a significant number of clients who both do not like, are not filled up by, and also do not have results with. And so I spend a lot of time saying, let's question the premise that I know that person told you should do it. I know it looks like this person is having success, but let's just question the premise for you as an individual. Should you really be doing that?
So let's say then you've got an author dealing with burnout. Maybe they do or don't know. What would you say are the most unexpected signs of burnout that people don't always consider? And does it look different for writers compared to people in other creative industries? Like if you're, say, an accountant and experiencing burnout?
So it does. If you don't take your work home with you, it often does look differently. When you have to work from home, which most writers do have to work from home, I do think that anyone who works from home, burnout will look slightly different, because you can't ever walk away from your job. Essentially, it follows you around in your home, and especially a lot of us are physically located, and so our physical location of our work will often find ourselves avoiding that physical location. And that's usually a signal of like the trend down into burnout, is when you just can't make yourself go around your desk that you have to write at or work at, or you just can't make yourself open the manuscript. And I don't think we take those warning signs as seriously as we should. Like I was having a conversation yesterday with someone and they were like, I can't even look at that part of my house without getting dread. And I was like, oh, that's a sign. Like we need to do something about that. And sometimes the sign of what I call like pre-burnout, right, where we're on the road down toward the pit. Sometimes those signs are so subtle that if we catch them early, we can really stave off the future burnout. But then we almost always have to fix something about the system. And that's usually what people won't do, because that is often costly or painful. And so they usually won't fix those problems, which is fine, because when burnout happens, we can deal with it, we'll recover from it. But there's almost always subtle signs that will help us just keep out of that place.
It's hard though, I think, because we are in that industry, or if it's just that kind of world we live in where people go, why aren't you doing more? Why am I not doing more? You should be constantly working. So sometimes you just think, well, I don't know about other people, but I suddenly think like, oh, why have I not done more of this? Why have I not finished this yet? And then as a result, you end up feeling worse in the long run, don't you?
Right. And some of the why haven't I done more is partly because we have expectations that are unrealistic about how the industry itself works or how the market works. Like I always say, what people really want in terms of if the industry would act the way we all want it to act is that Captain America is in charge of the industry. Everyone who's good and everyone who works hard and everyone who applies themselves will get the results that they're looking for. And there is an equal sense of results to hard work, a ratio That is what we would all like for it to be like. And unfortunately, Captain America is not in charge. Loki's in charge. I wish that Captain America would be in charge, because then everything would make sense. It would seem fair. It would seem equal. Everyone would get outcome that was based on the work that they put in. But chaos is in charge, and the market is capricious, and it is not predictable. And the people who tell us things like, well, if you would just work harder, embedded in that advice, the expectation that for everyone, hard work equals results. So when we have that expectation, almost always that's the expectation that's going to lead us into burnout, because believing that at the core of our being is what makes us work harder in order to get better results, or do more in order to get more results. And so if we believe that that is true, ultimately it's going to burn us out, unless we happen to be in that 1 to 3% of people for whom that is true in this industry. And it's a very small percentage of people for whom that is true.
Chaos is in charge is such a good quote. I think I'm going to remember that when I feel like things are not going right. It's like, it's fine. It's not me. Chaos is in charge.
You need a poster saying it.
Yeah.
Yes.
So good.
Like, thanks, Loki. I say that all the time. I'm always like, thanks, Loki, because it feels like when I have a release, for instance, that I've worked really hard on and I've done everything I can possibly do, and it doesn't go the way that I anticipate, the more that I expect that it should have gone the way I anticipate, the more stress I'm under, the more the amount of energy that I have to put forward to get the same result out of myself changes, right? Like I have to put a higher and higher and higher level of energy into the work in order to get a lower result. And eventually that disconnect is going to burn me out. And that's why, like you had mentioned, seeing so many people who were in or were headed into or have experienced burnout, that's why. Because Loki's in charge and we all want Loki not to be in charge. So our expectations are based on someone else being in charge of the industry. And then the more we wish that to be true, the more we act as though that's true, the more likely we are to burn out.
That makes sense. So you touched on it briefly there regarding some of the things that can lead to burnout. Have you noticed patterns in terms of the biggest triggers that cause writers to get into that burnout phase?
Yeah, so that disparity in expectation, like me expecting that if I just work harder or if I just do more, that I will get better results. That, first of all, is the biggest one. The second largest, treating my expectations for how I should work, for how I should write, how fast I should write, how I should switch genres or not, how I should write and work, treating all of those expectations as though they're not relevant to who I am as a person. Like if we expect something from ourselves just because someone else was able to do it, so someone else is able to write 10,000 words a day, and therefore I expect myself to be able to write 10,000 words a day. Like those are the biggest causes of burnout. And again, it's not the fault of the person who writes 10,000 words a day. They're doing exactly what they should be doing. They are aligned with themselves. But so many of us have this expectation that, which is faulty, that I can do whatever I want. Like if I want it bad enough, I can do it. If I want to write 10,000 words a day bad enough, I will be able to do it. That expectation causes more burnout than anything I have experienced yet in the writing industry.
That's so interesting. I know myself, I've been guilty of comparing to other people. And there's a quote we use quite often, which is comparing your beginning to someone else's middle kind of thing. And I definitely am guilty of that because I'm, as you may know, I'm just writing my first book now, but it's very easy to be comparing myself to people all the time. And like, I'm writing this book and I'm like, oh, but I'll read a different book, which is an author who's written like 20 books. I'm like, mine's not as good as this.
Right.
It's so unfair on myself. Like I shouldn't do it,
Right.
but I can't help it sometimes.
Right. Especially because when we are first looking at other successful people, I think we assume that the way to become more successful is to adopt the tactics of that successful person, as opposed to if you were to look at the breadth of every single successful writer out there, and to see just how many different paths there are to success, how many different ways you could potentially be successful, that acknowledging that there's someone else other than that person you're comparing yourself to, that you could be comparing yourself to, that would be helpful. So for instance, the not just like comparing myself to someone else who's on their first book, but also comparing myself to someone who has a similar process that I do, where my brain works similarly to how their brain works, so that I can look at like what would be a successful next step for me in my career, rather than just saying like, well, what I'm doing right now sucks. Well, right, but pick your favorite writer. What they were doing at one point in their career sucked as well, but how did they get to that next step, the next place in their journey?
Yeah, we often forget about the messy parts, and that person further on in their career made all those mistakes at the start.
Yep.
Maybe they're still making the mistakes. Having several books in your arsenal does not make you immune from making mistakes or burning out, or, just running out of ideas, or not wanting to write anymore, falling out of love with writing. No one is immune from those things.
Yep, exactly.
When it comes to a writer's actual mental health, what are the biggest misconceptions you see about that?
Almost always the biggest misconception is that nothing else matters to my writing. So like, I can be going through a divorce. I can be going through a death of someone close to me, or someone in my household who's ill. I can be going through a cross-country or cross-world move, or someone I love or know could be in crisis, or the world could be in crisis. And none of that should affect my mental health. Like, my mental health does not matter to my writing is the biggest misconception that I think people have. And some of that is because we do see evidence of people being able to compartmentalize in certain areas, or like each person might have a way that they could compartmentalize. But generally speaking, I see that mental health matters so much to our capacity to write, almost to the point where, like, I just did a coaching call with somebody yesterday where we were looking back over her 2-year burnout process that she's been in. And we were like, oh, here was where I switched my medication. Here was where I started doing, this particular type of health thing. Here was where I changed this environmental part. And all of a sudden at each level, we would see that her ability to cope and write went up significantly each time she addressed one of those things. And because we had this full 2-year look back, we were able to really identify like, oh, there's where that happened. And oh, here's where my word count was. And here's where my mental health was. And here's how all of that shifted. And I was telling her in this retrospective, I guess, that we were doing, right? I was like, people don't understand when they're going through that, though, how much of a difference it would make to go after stability instead of going after higher word counts, because fixing the stability is actually what will fix the word count, or fixing my health, especially if it has to do with cognitive health or biological health. Like if I'm going through, just to name a few, menopause, if I'm going through some kind of a biological change in my hormones, pregnancy is a big one, right? If I'm going through health concerns or moves, something that will shift my environmental stability, we often try to ignore those things because we're told we should be able to compartmentalize. And instead, what I see is, we should have addressed the stability in that moment and gone after stability more aggressively, so that we could get you to a mental health place where you were able to get your creativity back. Because creativity on Maslow's hierarchy is a higher level function. And we often don't think about the importance of what it means that Maslow's hierarchy has to be handled one step at a time. Like, you have to handle your physiological needs first and your biological needs first before you can access those higher levels of function.
It's funny you should mention stuff about health and environmental factors. I don't know if you've seen over there, we've had some pretty ridiculous weather over here in the UK. We've had droughts, we've had floods, we've had 40-degree weather with no air conditioning. I've barely written for like the past 6 weeks. I've barely even opened anything because 40 degrees.
Yeah, with no AC. I don't know
It's
how
horrible.
y'all are doing it.
Luckily, it was only 2 days. It was 2 days of
Okay.
hell. But then the weather kind of kept sticking at around like the mid 30s. And I was quite severely dehydrated in that time as well. So you can imagine what
Yep.
that did to my ability to think and
Right.
move.
Dehydration affects our brain on such a huge level. And like, yeah, and people just don't think about stuff like that. Yeah.
No, and it's little things like, okay, yeah, maybe you've increased how much you're drinking, but have you increased your salt intake so that you can absorb that water? Are you thinking about that?
Right.
Maybe you've got chronic fatigue syndrome like me. Are you taking a multivitamin to make sure that it is making a difference? Because
Yep.
multivitamins are one of the things that has been proven to make a difference to chronic fatigue syndrome, whereas 90% of other things don't work.
Yep.
Are you doing that research to be a participant in your own healthcare rather than just a passive patient being spoon fed how to look after yourself?
Right. Or thinking that it doesn't matter. I had a client who started doing B12 shots, and the difference in her cognitive capacity was so significant that she was able to show me where the difference was. And I was like on her word count, and I was like, that, I mean, just the difference between like balancing your biology. I'm not saying everyone should do B12 shots, right? Like, this is not medical advice. What I'm saying is basically what you just said, which is if you don't actively go after the things that are impairing your health, sometimes that alone could cause burnout because it's causing, again, the imbalance between your expectation of what you should be able to do and what you're able to do, and the imbalance between those two things is eventually going to cause burnout.
Yeah, my boyfriend has actually invested in getting a private blood test from a company called Thriver because the NHS won't cover him to have one because he's too seemingly
Mm.
healthy. But he wants to take those preventative measures. And based on what you just said, and talking to him, I'm like, they may not cover me just to do it for brain fog because of my fibro diagnosis, but
Right.
maybe it's not my fibro that exacerbates it. I don't
Right.
eat enough meat or get enough B vitamins. Could it be that? I know that's a factor. Could it be vitamin D? I know that's a
Yep.
factor. There are
Yep.
so many things that can impact our ability to think clearly. And just because we've
Yep.
got a diagnosis of one thing, that doesn't mean it's not actually a compounding of factors that are just making you feel progressively worse and worse, particularly if you've got multiple health
Right.
conditions.
Right. Multiple health conditions, or you're not monitoring things like water intake and, like you said, vitamin D and vitamin B12, like just little things that we wouldn't consider all the time to go after. It's like, have you dealt with the baseline questions of, am I balanced? Am I eating enough water or drinking enough water? Am I eating foods that are getting me all of the vitamins and minerals that I need in order for my body to function at its best? It's amazing the difference that some of those biological factors make. Like, we do this interesting experiment every once in a while where we're like, okay, everybody just start drinking 2 glasses of water when you wake up. Like, that's all we're going to try to do for a while and just see what the difference is and how you feel. And it's like 2 weeks later, everybody's less tired, like everybody's feeling better. And we're like, the just drinking enough water every day is such a big difference maker. And most of us are not drinking enough water consistently, like that it would make a big difference.
The main thing that's really making the difference to me is getting out of bed, dragging my ass out of bed. Let's be serious. I don't want to do it. And exercising. The more I get
Yeah.
my heart rate up first thing in the morning, usually boxing to get some aggression out, sometimes a bit of dance, the better I feel for the rest of the day and the more I can do. And I'm less tired. And I don't necessarily enjoy exercise, although I enjoy imaginary shadow, but like shadow boxing for imaginary
Yeah.
things. But it makes such a difference. It really does.
Just going back to burnout then, when someone is heading towards burnout, is there a point that they can bounce back from the sort of precipice? Or is it at that point just inevitable? There's no turning back?
Oh yeah, I think you can always bounce back. But the changes that you often have to make are so significant that most of us don't want to do that, right? Like, so I'll just give a couple of examples. One is we often see people are headed towards burnout when they are counting on a future payout of something in order to make all of the work that they've been doing worth it. And then when you count on that future payout happening, if it doesn't happen, it creates such a significant, not depression medically, but like a depressive feeling, right? Like a frustration, anger, sadness feeling that that triggers other things, right? Like it makes us want to work harder and whatever. So it's almost always systemic. Another way that we often see burnout is the expectation that I'm never going to have to pay the consequences for my health decisions. So we are definitely wired to be feast and famine as humans. So like you can absolutely binge write where you're binge writing, for a couple of weeks and not getting a ton of sleep. And then you start sleeping again. We call it phoenixing, right? Where you work really hot and then you recover for a while, and then you work really hot and then you recover. But if you're not allowing yourself those recovery periods when you're phoenixing, there's only a short amount of time that you can do that. So to Ellie's point, or to Ellie's question, if I am not willing to change the fact that I'm not allowing myself recovery, which might mean that I have to slow down production or slow down my release schedule or change my expectations about the income that I'm making or those types of things, that's often why we see burnout happen, is because the things we would have to change or give up are things that we are not prepared to give up in that moment. And then burnout makes us ask the question, do I want to go back to that? Or am I willing to change my expectations, which might often mean things like getting a second job or going back to a day job that I had previously quit, or asking my parents for money, or asking my spouse to carry or partner to carry the majority of the finances for the household for some time. Like those are all very, very painful discussions to have. And they aren't always things that we want to do preventatively. Sometimes they have to be reactionary. And so I would say, is it possible to stave it off? Absolutely. Is it likely to happen? It's very rare. And usually the reason it happens is because they've been through major burnout before and they don't want to go through it again.
I suppose part of it must be what you said before about being able to step back and reflect on the situation and notice what you're doing and notice the patterns and notice what you're not getting and not giving yourself enough of.
Yeah. Yes, that is a huge piece of it. And I think another huge part is what we believe is true about the industry is instinctively wrong. Like we believe that we have to make the money now or we're never going to be able to make it. Because of course, during the gold rush, 2009 to 2016, 17, 18, during the gold rush, that was absolutely true. Like people were coming in, doing very little, making in terms of not doing all of the giant marketing campaigns and all of the, it was much, much easier to just write a book and release it and make money during the gold rush. And so there was this feeling of as quickly as possible, let's make as much money as we can because soon the gold rush will be over. Well, yes, absolutely, that was true. But now the gold rush is over. And now it is an established industry that we live in and work in, which means that the money's not going anywhere. The money's always going to be accessible. You do not have to make it right now in order to be able to make it. That's gold rush mentality. So now that we are officially into the established industry of indie publishing, that means that there's always going to be room. There's always room in terms of it's always possible to break into a new genre, even if it's saturated. It's always possible. But then that means that it's more and more likely that you're going to have to maintain the way that you're doing it. So it really needs to be sustainable because Gold Rush is about speed and quickness, and established industry is about sustainability.
Say someone is going through burnout, what would be the worst possible thing for them to do in that moment?
Oh, that's such a good question. I'd have to think about that. Because usually when you hit the absolute bottom of the pit, the bottom, you can't do anything. You often, when you go through real burnout, your body and system will automatically force you to not be able to work anymore. And so there's often, even if you wanted to make the choice to try to continue keeping the speed up that you were at, you often won't be able to do that. I very rarely see someone who does this because usually they adjust because they realize that something made them get here and they have to adjust something. But I would say not adjusting to reality would be the worst possible thing you could do, because then you'll just hang out in the pit for forever. Like you'll just keep kind of making enough energy for yourself to jump out just a little bit, and then you'll end up right back there again, and then you'll come out a little bit and end up right back there again. So like I have seen, usually not people that I know personally, but I have observed people basically hanging out somewhere around the bottom of the pit for a long time because they're just not willing to readjust themselves in whatever way it would take readjusting. Because sometimes it isn't slowing down the pace of release. Sometimes it's bringing on help, or hiring other people to give assistance when you need it, or getting a part-time job to defer some of the pressure of the finances so that you can continue to do the releasing and writing. But yeah, I would say not adjusting is the biggest mistake that people could make. But I rarely see people do that.
Well, I'm glad to hear you don't see people doing that very often, at least.
Well, most of it is because they can't. Like burnout is it's so biological that they're usually just not able, and it's never something they're happy about, but they're usually just not able to continue, especially from a creative perspective. Like we will sometimes see teachers being burnt out and continuing to teach for decades after they burned out, and just staying in that burnout place because they can't do anything else professionally. They've committed to wanting to do that job. But with writers, we don't tend to see that because you have to have creative access in order to produce the work that we do, and usually burnout shuts off the access to your creativity.
That makes sense. What would you say then is one thing that you wish every writer knew about burnout?
Oh, okay. So this is gonna sound weird to some of us, but
we like weird
burnout,
here. We're all about weird here. Don't worry.
I'm glad you like weird. Burnout is so different for every single person that you can't really look at what someone else has done as a way of identifying for yourself what should happen. And so often the way to respond to burnout is something that's instinctive and intuitive to you. And if you would just listen to what your body and your system are telling you to do, that you would recover from it. It's just that a lot of us are looking for like, but how quickly can I get out of this? Like, how quickly can I get out of this? And I'm like, oh no, like for some of us, it will take years to get out of burnout. For some of us, it will be very short, right? Like I've seen people get out of burnout in 3 to 6 months, and I've seen it take 3 to 5 years.
But there's no magic pill, is there? People want that magic pill to just be like, fix me. I want to be fixed now.
Yeah, they do. But I would say also that's part of what got you here, right? Like in terms of like what got us into burnout is that we were looking for the magic pill to give us all the success that we want with none of the pain. And so we took shortcuts that would get us to that place. And now we're paying the consequences for that. So I would say like one of the most important things we can do as we look at coming out of burnout is stop expecting that there's going to be a way to do this job that doesn't hurt, or that isn't painful, or that isn't on some level, there are things that we just don't like or don't want to do or are frustrated by. Like that's normal. That's just living. That's human life.
Yeah, I've had discussions with some of my other friends about burnout, and I know their experiences were vastly different to mine, but it was that whole like they couldn't function. Like they struggled to reply to a message, when I texted them. And like I know for me, I realized I was in burnout again last year, and I couldn't articulate a sentence. I couldn't speak, and I was just crying. I remember just standing in the kitchen with my boyfriend trying to answer his question, and I just fell apart. My brain completely shut down. It was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. But that was kind of a pivotal moment for me at the same time. And I was like, I've got to change my priorities. I can't keep going on like this.
And that's the best sentence you could ever have uttered in terms of like, how do you respond to burnout? Is because that's what gets us there. Is the priority of behavior or of where our energy goes to is so different from what it should be that we have to change something systematically about ourselves, not just like, so there was an article that went around not long ago about like, you can't self-care your way out of burnout. And there was a part of me that was like, wait, don't like, don't say something like that, because we do need a lot of self-care to repair from burnout. But the core of the article was like, you can't just work yourself to the bone and then take a bath on the weekend and expect that you're going to be okay, right? Which I do agree with the concept there. But also usually the reason we burn out is because we're depreferencing the care of ourselves, including sometimes like the comment that you made about your boyfriend wanting to go and get this test for preventative measures. I was like, yes, that's perfect self-care example. Most of us don't like doctors. Most of us don't like blood tests. And I mean, doctors as humans are fine, but like we don't like attending medical appointments, right?
Yeah.
We love you, doctors. You're great. Um, but but that pain is self-care. Like me going to the doctor to find out what's wrong with my body when it's not functioning the way that it could is self-care, in the same way that taking a bath on the weekend is self-care. Me setting boundaries with my parents or my sisters or my brothers or children, that is self-care. Like all of those things are helping us to have a sustainable life and career. Anything that builds sustainability is ultimately self-care. And that is how we get out of burnout. But then sometimes that means, like you said, changing my priorities or reprioritizing something that has been forgotten.
One thing that I found that really helps, that I actually felt guilty for until I read your book on burnout, was that I watch a lot of TV and
Mhm.
I always felt guilty for it. Like I'm more of a TV watcher than I am a book reader. I love books, but TV is what I learned to write and learn to read from watching
Mhm.
TV. What am I saying? I understood storytelling and characterization and dialogue from watching TV, not
Yeah.
from reading books, because I struggled to concentrate reading a book growing up. And now, like, I read your book and you talk about how some authors recharge their creative batteries from things like watching TV or playing games. And it was like a light bulb moment. It's like, actually, no, the fact that I do some editing or I do some writing and take a break and watch an episode of a TV show is a good thing. It's not
Yep.
inherently making me a bad person. I'm self-employed. I can work whatever hours I want. That's literally why I'm self-employed. So why am I making myself feel guilty or trying to
Yeah.
punish myself with traditional hours when actually what I've been doing all along is better for me?
Yes, exactly. I love that you put it that way also, because so often our intuition is actually the right answer. And instead we go looking outside of ourselves. We're like, well, wait, but what do the experts say that I should do? And I'm like, well, the experts don't live in your house. So their opinion doesn't matter. Like if I don't care if the literal like president of the world, if there was such a thing, was like, you shouldn't be watching television, I'd be like, well, wait a minute though. 5,000 interviews with authors say different, sir or ma'am. And I apologize, but you're wrong. Like, because I have actually seen it be generative for people, and not just they feel better when they do it, but they become more creative as a result. They understand things better. They learn from television. Like, there may be people who are visual and auditory learners that are really only going to process when they see something live in front of them in a way that they wouldn't if they were trying to assimilate words into their brain. That has nothing to do with whether or not they could be a good writer. Like plenty of people who are good writers watch a lot of television, but for some reason we have this expectation that the morally good answer is no, you should work 8 hours a day. And then Becca comes along and is like, wait, why should we work 8 hours a day? Because some industrialist capitalist person in the 1800s, 19th century decided that 8 hours a day was the correct number of hours for you to spend working. Why? Because it's the best for you? No, they would rather that you work 16 hours a day and sleep 8 hours a day. But if you work 16 hours a day, who's going to buy the cars that you're working on? No one. So they make you work only 8 hours a day. So you have 8 hours to be a consumer, and then 8 hours becomes the preferred amount of work that they want you to do. And we don't realize that every choice that we think we're supposed to make is based on a system that somebody else just decided this is the way we should do it. It's not actually based on truth or logic or any, and I mean every rule that we think is correct. Rules like writer's right or don't edit as you go or any of these things. It's like, oh no, 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 no. those are all mythology for more than half of the population. But instead of questioning the repetition of the advice, we instead question ourselves. Well, if I'm not writing every day, there must be something wrong with me. So let me change my behavior to fit the standard instead of, but the standard's wrong. Like the standard does not apply. So again, I know this is me getting preachy about this, but it just frustrates me so much that we question ourselves first, when so often our own intuition about how we should be functioning is actually correct, and it will help us produce better work, but we won't let ourselves do it because somebody told us we should do whatever the thing is, right? Work 8 hours a day, don't watch television, blah, 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 whatever it is.
I think it ties back into what we talked about earlier about being a participant rather than just taking everything passively. Because, yes, okay, we can say XYZ piece of writing advice, but you've got to understand the reasoning behind it. Because for some people, some of that advice is going to be great. And for other people, it's going to be so much work that it's going to make their head explode. Like, I outline my books in quite a bit of depth now, but if I did that 6 years ago, I would have been a crying mess on the floor. Like, I have changed as a person, and what I need from my writing system has changed. And I think it's also important to remember that you will change and your processes will change as well. What you need from your books, what your books need from you, how you work, how you think. And also, COVID just threw everything up in the air and completely changed everything for everyone, because it was like almost a worldwide period of mourning past lives that are never going to be the same again. And we're still adjusting now.
The pandemic on its own, for most of us, was a big enough life change event that I think we need to be questioning what we used to believe about a lot of things, and what might be different for us now. And the other piece too, and this is a sort of unpopular thing to talk about, but those of us who have had COVID, there's so much evidence that COVID changes something biologically about your body. Like the number of people I've coached who have cognitive change, like still years after having COVID. I had COVID almost 2 years ago, and I'm not the same person I was before I had it. Even just things like, are there adjustments that I need to make to my life based on I had an illness, or I had something that biologically changed me, or I had children, or I got married or divorced, or like there's all these things that could so fundamentally change the environment that we live in, which affects everything that we do. And then the big piece for me is knowing what's changeable and what isn't. Like knowing what parts of you are possible to change and what aren't. Like, what can I release an expectation that I'm holding of myself? And then what can I potentially work on? And I do think asking those questions are so important. And again, I come back to like, our intuition is just so honed, and so many of us need to just listen to the intuitive thing that our brain is telling us we need, and stop listening to like what some other person is telling us we should be doing.
If someone is in the midst of burnout, what are your top tips for them to heal from that and also prevent it from happening again? Because most of the people I know who've burnt out, it never happens just once.
Yeah, that's so true. I go back and forth on whether I think that that we should be concerned with burning out more than once, because I do think that some of us have that. There are some expectations that we hold about our life and about what it means to work hard that I just think are always going to cause us to burn out on some level. And I'm one of those people. Again, the Phoenix sort of, archetype is definitely how I function. And so I would say that if you are currently in the midst of burnout or on the precipice of burnout, I would look hard at what got you there. Are there expectations that you have that you are not willing to change that continue to drive you into burnout over and over again? And the hard part is that some of those expectations will need either therapy or like real internal cognitive work about like your own self-awareness work. And that's the thing that takes time and doesn't always appear to have a payoff. But again, like I used the example of the client that I was just coaching, where we were looking back at her 2 years, of burnout, recovery that she was going through. And I was like, you never want to go through that again, do you? And she was like, no. And I'm like, well, look at all the things that you've changed in these like step ups, like how you changed your expectations. And I'm like, if you hold to that new version of yourself, there's less of a chance that you're ever going to go through something like this again. But the other piece too is I do think self-care is very, very important. And not all self-care looks like eating chocolate and, going to sleep. Like some self-care is, should this person be in my life anymore? Should I continue to participate in this community? Should I keep holding this particular expectation of myself? Are my expectations good for me? Are they producing good things? Those types of kind of bigger picture questions, I think, are the ones we don't often want to ask, but they're almost always the deciders in terms of how badly am I going to burn out again.
We do have one very important question for you, the most important question of the whole podcast, which is which one book changed your life?
Ooh, probably Flow, the book Flow by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. And if any of you haven't heard, I'm not sure how to spell his name ever well, but I will say, if you search for Flow and then Mihaly is his first name, Mihai. But this book, so until I read Flow, I don't think I really understood the importance of challenge in my life, because I think so many of us are pain averse, and I'm a very pain averse person. I would like to have as little pain as humanly possible in my life, and most of us are like that. But there's good pain and bad pain, and I don't think I really understood good pain and bad pain until I read the book Flow, and understanding that when you have good pain and and it's coming from that challenge level, your capacity to do good work, however you define that, is directly related to the level of challenge that you're presenting yourself with. So you will always rise to the challenge if you present yourself with challenges that you're able to rise to, rather than let me do only the least that I need to do, right? Like just the least amount of pain possible. So understanding the difference between good pain and bad pain was probably the most defining aspect of mine. I read that book early. I think I was 24 or 25 when I read that, and it really changed my life.
That reminds me, I did watch his TED Talk on that. And that made me realize, oh, that's how I wrote my first book so fast. I didn't know it was a thing until after. Because like you say,
you got into flow state.
Yeah, it was that perfect balance of challenge and enjoyment, and that's how I got into flow, and that's how I was working on it so quickly. And then there have been other books that I've been able to reach a state of flow more easily as well, for different reasons. Like when I changed genres, it was easier because I was in that kind of avenue again. And I think it is important to think about the fact it's not just about word count. That's not the only way to challenge yourself as a writer. There are other ways to do it. Like when I first started outlining, that was a new way for me to do it. And I often got into a state of flow doing the outline. Or like when I tried to write my reader magnet using that outline, and I, created the reader magnet in about a week because I got into that state of flow when I was writing it and when I was editing it, and I enjoyed the whole thing, but also it was different enough that I got that flow and I got that dopamine, and it made me feel very accomplished.
Yeah, that new and different need as a personality trait, when you have that type of personality where you will be more engaged if you do something new. There are so many writers that have that, and they don't take it as seriously as I would like to see them take it, because we're so encouraged to just rinse, lather, repeat, do the same thing over and over, never change anything. Once you get to the place where things are working, that's the way it should be forever. But there are so many of us who have this need for new and different, and I have many of those personality traits. So if I'm not constantly presenting myself with new opportunities to learn or an opportunity to try something I've never tried before, I will slow down and I will become less productive, even if I'm doing something that quote unquote will make me less productive, like switching to a new genre or switching between series or traveling or doing like learning a new skill, I don't take into account how much I need to do those things in order to maintain my capacity to work. And I really wish that more writers who had that new and different need would take that very seriously.
I just had an epiphany.
Hmm.
Now I know why my fantasy is easier to write.
Mm-hmm.
Because I kind of dug myself into a bit of a hole with my first two series. I knew exactly how both series were going to end, but like, you know, there's like 14 books in the universe so far. I've got more planned and stuff. And, you know, because of that point, it does start to feel a little bit less challenging, being completely
Yeah.
honest. Whereas with
Yep.
my fantasy, I intentionally structured it so that I had more freedom. And, you know, it's just less limiting because I called it
Yep.
Afterlife Cause. I didn't put the word ghost in the title, so I can play with the afterlife in a much more versatile way. And it
Yep.
gives me that creative freedom to play with different ghost tropes, to play with different horror tropes. If I want to do something a bit more actiony, if I want to do something a bit more lit fic, if I want to do something a bit more spooky, my readers have come to expect that because there's 4 books in the series and they
Yep.
are all slightly different, but also all slightly the same.
Yep. Yep. Like that level of challenge that you make for yourself, if you have a personality like that, is going to make you faster and better. And you know what I mean? Like that ability to know exactly what you need and then give yourself exactly what you need, no matter what anybody else thinks, is literally the best skill that any of us could ever develop as writers. There is no better skill because that's what will keep us continuing to rise to the challenge and rise to the challenge and rise to the challenge in a way that will never happen if all we do is follow someone else's advice all the time.
I don't know a better note to end the podcast on than that. Do you, Ellie?
That's perfect. I love that.
Where can our lovely writers go if they want to find out more about you and your coaching, the Quitcast, the Quit books, etc.?
So I would go to our YouTube channel, the Quitcast and the Quitcast for Writers, and I would watch those videos. Because if this is the first time you're hearing about me or the work that I do, I always say the best way to determine if what we do is for you is to watch a bunch of the videos and see if it resonates. Because like everything, nothing resonates with everyone. And so I would hate to see people just like immediately purchase a book or buy a class or something if they're eventually not going to resonate with what we do. So we have a ton of free videos on the YouTube channel. Go and watch those. And if something sparks, you know, something that you want to work out, burnout, we have a lot of burnout resources there. We have a whole series of videos just on intuitive writing. We obviously have a lot of resources on personality stuff. We do a ton of that. And then we have some very niche-y, like planning and things like that, some really small series that are on very specific topics. So there's an awful lot of information there, and that's probably where I would start.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us. I feel like I've had about 3 epiphanies in the last hour. So hopefully it's inspired other authors too.
If you found this episode interesting or helpful, make sure you subscribe to The Writer's Mindset on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform, or all of them. We don't mind.
Everything from a like to a rating to a review to a subscribe to shouting about us on social media helps us to reach more writers so that they can overcome the mindset issues that are holding them back with their writing too.
If you're on social media, come join us on Instagram at Writers Mindset Pod, or join our Facebook group, which you can find by searching for The Writer's Mindset.
And don't forget to come join us over on Patreon for our bonus series, Healthy Habits.
See you next time.
Keep writing.